Okay, so I'm here with Dr. Dustin Crummett, and today we're going to discuss gun control and some other arguments for guns and against guns. So, Dustin, if you could just introduce yourself, just give a
Mhm.
little background.
So I got a PhD from the University of Notre Dame in January of 2018. Um, I recently have been working as a postdoc at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Um, I'm back in the U.S. and I'm staying with family, which is why I'm in. You can see the basement here. My cats are down on the floor around me, so I hope they don't.
They might jump up. They could jump
Yeah,
up.
yeah. But yeah, so I've been doing that. I've been working on animal ethics at LMU. But I've also done, I've done work in political philosophy, in applied ethics, and philosophy of religion. I've published 2 papers on gun control. Um, so that's what we're going to be talking about here, I guess.
Cool. Thanks. Great introduction. So yeah, we could just kind of get into it. So what is gun control? I mean, it seems like this core dogma really rests in more severe restrictions on guns entails less murder rates and other gun related crimes.
Mhm. Yes, I take it what is gun control itself is something like state regulation of firearms, something like that. Laws regulating, restricting firearms. Um, so thought of in that way, gun control encompasses everything from banning all guns to saying that children can't buy machine guns, to saying that felons can't buy handguns, to saying that you need to have a waiting period to buy a gun, saying that you need to put a trigger lock on your gun when it's stored, a wide range of different things. And so thought of in that way, everybody supports some gun control. Everybody agrees 8-year-olds shouldn't have machine guns.
Right.
Uh, but I take it the real political debate is over, okay, do we need more gun control? Do we need less? Do we need more of some sorts and less of others? These sorts of things.
Okay. So what is the best argument for gun control?
Yeah. So I take it the best argument for, for any sort, including not letting kids have guns,
Right.
but specifically for the more restrictive measures that are controversial, is just, look, guns are really dangerous. They cause a lot of deaths, a lot of injuries. And hopefully by regulating them, we can reduce this. So something like 40,000 people in the US every year die because of firearms. They're shot to death. About 15,000 of those are murders, about 25,000 are suicides, if I'm remembering correctly, and then a couple hundred are accidents. Even the suicides, we have good reason to think that a lot of those probably wouldn't happen if not for guns. Reason being, first of all, suicide tends to be very impulsive. People often do it on the spur of the moment with relatively little planning. They might not have the energy or the executive function to do anything very difficult at that time. Guns are a very easy way to commit suicide. It can be done very quickly, so you don't have time to change your mind. You're not going to be deterred by having to go through a lot of effort, something like that. Also, they're much more lethal than other suicide methods. And we know that people who attempt suicide and survive, something like 90% ultimately do not die by suicide. And in fact, the significant majority never attempt suicide again. They attempt it and then they think, that wasn't actually what I wanted at all. And they go on to work out whatever problems they had in some other
Right.
way.
Right.
So if you attempt it with a much more lethal method, that's not going to happen, right? You're much more likely to just die.
Yeah.
And in fact, when we look at studies of, that try to control for confounders and correlate firearm ownership with suicide rates, we find out that these are correlated, right? So guns I think quite plausibly result in tens of thousands of excess deaths every year, many more people being wounded, being bereaved, being traumatized, being terrorized, and that's not good. So we want to reduce that. If you want to reduce that, then there are a lot of things that you're going to want to do. Address the causes of crime, address poverty, try to help people with mental illnesses, try to bring about cultural changes so that maybe people don't feel like they need a gun.
Right.
But some of the things you're going to want to do are legal measures. And I think when we look at the social science, you have to sort of expect, I guess, that any politically charged issue, there's going to be a controversy. There will be people putting out studies on both sides or whatever.
Okay. Right.
I think that the bulk of the people who study this agree, and I think the best studies suggest that there really are things we can do with gun control that will reduce gun deaths.
Right. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Your screen froze up a bit.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good.
Okay. Yeah.
Just wanted to let you know.
Oh yeah, sure. Sometimes the connection can be extremely spotty, but I hope it works out. What was I saying? Oh yeah. So I mean, it's a difficult topic to study in certain ways. It's not like you can do a randomized controlled trial exactly.
Right.
But you can look at different jurisdictions with different gun laws, try to control for confounders, see how different gun laws affect rates of gun violence. And you can look at one in the same jurisdiction before and after it changed its gun laws and see what happens. So for instance, Connecticut in 1995 passed this law mandating permits for handguns. So in order to get a handgun, you have to pass a background check, and you have to undergo some kind of safety training thing. And sure enough, gun homicides dropped by about 40% afterwards. There wasn't a corresponding increase in other kinds of murder. So it's not like, all the people just use knives and did the same amount of murders. Right. There also wasn't a corresponding decrease. So it's not like, the murder rate was going to drop by that much anyway, and the gun law didn't make any difference, right? On the other hand, Missouri had a law that was very similar. In 2007, they repealed it, and gun homicides went up. And same things can be said. So it really looks like the law does what it's supposed to do. If you make it more difficult for dangerous people to get guns, then it's more difficult for dangerous people to get guns. And so they're less likely to have guns, so they're less likely to shoot people with guns.
Right.
We also find, even though this wasn't the intent of the law, that gun suicides went down in Connecticut and gun suicides went up in Missouri because the law meant fewer people had guns, and that because guns are harder to get, someone who is suicidal, if they have to go through this whole long process, has more time to change their minds, it might deter them and so on. So I think that empirically, there are gun control measures that we know do a good job that reduce homicide rates, that reduce suicide rates, that reduce accidental deaths, things like gun locks can reduce accidental deaths. And so that's going to be part of what you want to do if you're trying to reduce rates of gun violence.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, this kind of leads into my third question. What do you think the best argument against gun control is? So I imagine this would kind of lead into self-defense, like a prima facie right to own a weapon. And it's a weighty right too, so that can be hard to infringe upon. So what would you say about that?
Yeah, so at least the most philosophically interesting, I would say, is one that's been defended by Michael Huemer and some other people. So Huemer thinks, look, in general, your reasons to not violate a right are stronger than your reasons to not allow a right to be violated. So I couldn't murder you to prevent two other people from carrying out murders, say.
Right.
It might be that I could murder you to prevent 1,000 murders. There's some threshold. Okay, you just got to do it.
Right.
But it's not just, if you're just going to do slightly more good, you can't violate the right yourself.
Right. It has to be much greater than that.
Yeah. Right. And Huemer thinks Well, look, murdering somebody, that's violating their rights. What about preventing them from defending themselves so that they get murdered? That's an equally severe rights violation. If somebody's going to come and stab you to death and you're going to fight them off and I run up and I put you in a bear hug,
right.
I keep you from fighting them. Well, that's as bad as stabbing you, right?
Yeah.
Well, suppose I don't put you in a bear hug. What happens is you have a gun and you're going to defend yourself. And I grab the gun out of your hand and then the guy stabs you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, suppose it's not quite that. What it is you have a gun in your nightstand. And before the murderer comes, I sneak in and take it out of your nightstand. And then you can't defend yourself and you get murdered. Well, that doesn't make any difference, right? So that's comparable to killing you myself.
Yeah.
And humor thinks, okay, suppose it's true that gun control measures are going to save lives on balance. They will still cost some lives. There will be some people who, at least, and this is a little tricky because he's thinking of gun control as like a total gun ban. More mild measures, waiting periods, whatever. This may not be as true. But at least when we're talking about very restrictive gun measures, some people will not be able to get guns. And as a result, will be victimized and unable to defend themselves. And so they will be assaulted or murdered or robbed or whatever. And because the government is responsible for their inability to defend themselves, it's much more like the government doing it itself, right? And so because the burden is so much higher when the government is acting to remove the right, the means of self-defense, as opposed to when it's just allowing an unjust assault. That means that just because it saves some lives on balance, that's not enough. If it saves way, way, way more lives on balance, that might be enough. But of course, that's a harder bar to meet empirically, right?
Right.
So that's humor's argument. And I have a co-authored paper that came out in the journal Ergo. And it's open access, so people can find it online.
Okay.
I have a paper that I co-authored with Philip Swenson, who's a professor at William and Mary, where we respond to this argument. And our suggestion is, okay, so suppose it's the case, lives are going to be saved on balance, but some lives are going to be lost as the result of a gun control measure. Question, can we identify in advance which lives are going to be lost, or at least which people are going to be put at special risk? Well, if we can, then we might implement what's called a restrictive licensing system. So there are countries in the world where you can get guns, provided you demonstrate that you have some special reason. Or you can get certain kinds of guns, maybe you can get a handgun, provided you demonstrate that you have some special reason. So it might be that, yeah, the woman who needs a handgun because she has an abusive ex-husband, yeah, maybe, okay, so let her get a gun.
Right.
So you should make exceptions in cases where you realize that the policy is going to put someone at much greater risk. But setting aside those cases, now we have a bunch of people. We know that if you look at the whole population, we know that the policy will result in some of them being killed, more of them being saved, and we don't know who is who. So now we have a situation where, and we're drawing on this work that Casper Hare has done, who's a professor at MIT. We have a situation where it looks like even though implementing the policy will hurt some people, it's in everyone's expected best interest that we implement the policy. Everyone is at less risk going in, even though there will be some people who will be harmed who wouldn't have been.
Okay.
And Hare argues that in those cases, you can do the thing that's going to hurt some people because you're acting in everyone's expected best interest. You're acting in a rationally beneficent way towards everyone, even though you know that it will fail for some people. Just as, he gives this kind of convoluted example where there's a trolley going down the tracks, okay? And the trolley is going to hit 5 people if it keeps going, or I can switch it and it will hit 1 person. But plot twist, all the people are in like big luggage trunks. So I don't know who is where.
Right.
I don't know whether you are, I know that you're on the track somewhere, but I don't know if you're the one or if you're among the five.
Right.
And now I think, what should I do on Eric's behalf? And I think, well, it's much more likely that Eric is with the five than with the one.
Mm-hmm.
So I should switch insofar as I care about Eric. And I can apply the same reasoning to everybody else. Now, at some point, that reasoning will fail. It could be that you were the one and you die because of my choice. But I still acted in the way that demonstrated the most concern for your welfare, given the information available to me, right? Mm-hmm. So Hare thinks in this sort of situation, you can do the thing that will hurt some people, but will help people in balance, the thing that's in everyone's expected best interest.
Okay.
We agree. And so we suggest, provided the gun control policy at least has these exceptions for people placed at special risk, it will be justified despite the humor style argument. That's roughly, I mean, we say a lot more and people can read the paper. But,
right.
That's
it's a kind of breakdown. So yeah, I just want to let you know, it's not really a big deal. We could still just talk, but your screen is frozen. I just want to make you aware of that, but it's not a big deal if it keeps happening. No worries.
Well, let's see.
Oh, you're good. Yeah. Okay. So you kind of addressed my fourth question was, we have a prima facie right to own a weapon. How can you infringe upon that and tell people they can't have weapons? Yeah, you kind of addressed that. So I kind of wanted to go into the quote by Thomas Sowell. You're familiar with Sowell, right?
Yeah.
So he says, despite hundreds of thousands of times a year when Americans use firearms defensively, none of those incidences is likely to be reported in the mainstream media, even when lives are saved as a result. But one accidental firearm death in a home will be broadcast and rebroadcast from coast to coast. So this is kind of another dogma among people in favor of gun control that, children can get, killed with guns in homes. So how would you address that? And I can read it again if need be.
Yeah, no. It's false that there are hundreds of thousands of defensive gun uses in the US.
Okay.
We don't know how many there are, but there aren't hundreds of thousands. You hear, hundreds of thousands. Sometimes people say 2 million or something like that. The way that you get these figures is through surveys. You survey a bunch of people and you ask, have you used a gun defensively in the last 12 months? And you figure out how many people say that, you multiply. Oh, okay, so there must have been 500,000 defensive uses of guns in the US. The problem is, anytime you attempt to survey people about a very low occurrence event, you're going to way overestimate. So we wonder, how many Americans have met the Pope in the last 12 months? And we decide to do a survey. I don't know how many Americans have met the Pope. But I can predict this. More people will falsely say that they met the Pope than really met the Pope, right? Because they think it makes them sound impressive, or they get a kick out of lying to the interviewer, or they just misunderstood the question, or they misspoke, or they pushed the wrong button, or they did meet the Pope 20 years ago and they figure like, well, that should really count. Or they saw the Pope's motorcade and well, that's kind of like meeting the Pope, whatever. We're going to get survey results, but what we're going to find out really is how many people tell you that they met the Pope when they really did. Many times more people will do that than actually met the Pope. And something similar is going on with this question about defensive uses of guns. We know that because when you do surveys and ask, have you shot someone defensively? It turns out the number of people who are shot defensively every year is way greater than the number of people who are shot every year, as judged by medical records and police records, right? Okay. Which of course is not possible. So we know that people are answering incorrectly because they misunderstand the question, or they get a kick out of lying to the interviewer, or they think it sounds badass to say that they used a gun, or maybe they have some sort of political motivation. They think it will be good for sticking it to the gun, whatever causes people to do this. That's false. So that method is not a good method of determining what the impact of guns is. Now, it's also true, just like watching the news and seeing, whether you hear about somebody. I mean, that's not a very good method either, right?
Oh yeah, right.
So
Definitely,
that's
definitely
not
not.
the alternative.
Yeah.
The alternative is doing what I suggested before, trying to look at different jurisdictions, trying to look at one in the same jurisdiction before and after implementing or repealing gun measures. And through these sorts of statistical approaches, I think we find that at least some gun measures really do save lives.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Real quick, Dustin. So yeah, your camera's frozen again. So I kind of have an idea. When your camera freezes, I'll just put. Can you see the chat right now? I'll just enter something in the chat, like any letter,
okay.
and that will kind of alert. Because I think when you
All right.
backed out of your camera and restarted it, it works. So it happens. Connections, pain in the ass sometimes. Yeah, it's working. So if I see that happen, I'll just put in a random letter.
Good.
Okay, cool. So yeah, question 5. I mean, you kind of did address some of this too, but do gun control laws really control guns, or do they just disarm law-abiding citizens and therefore make them easier targets for criminals who are not going to obey the law anyway, just like they reject all kinds of other laws?
Yeah, I think I think, I've sort of already said some stuff. I think you just have to look at,
right.
I mean, well, one thing to say is, insofar as what you're concerned about is preventing accidents or preventing suicides, you're talking about people who presumably are generally law abiding. So keeping guns out of the hands of criminals is a goal of gun control. It's not the only one.
And most of us would agree with that, if not everyone. I mean, no one wants criminals to have weapons.
Yeah, right.
Right.
And so I think, I mean, generally speaking, if you make something harder to do and you make it riskier, then fewer people are going to do it. So there will be some criminals who don't get guns because of the gun control measures, and there will be some that still do. And then you have to just look at population level data and figure out.
Because there's always going to be a way to get guns for criminals.
And we don't think, oh, well, why are artillery pieces illegal? Like, somebody will always just be able to get, I mean, it's true that people will always be able to get illegal things. Maybe not artillery pieces, drugs.
Right.
They're illegal. Lots of people still think, well, there should be at least some drug laws, right? How many there should be, what the penalties should be, that's very controversial. But in general, we don't just use this, just make everything illegal or make everything legal because criminals are going to break the law anyway. Who cares? You have to look at the specific case.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. We don't really say that in any other circumstance.
Yeah.
Unless you're libertarian. to some extent, maybe. So question 6, what about countries with stronger gun control laws who happen to have higher murder rates? So for instance, like Russia, Brazil, and Mexico have pretty severe gun restrictions, but they have higher murder rates than the US. What would you say to that?
Well, so you have to, I mean, the short answer is that the way to address the question is not to kind of like cherry pick examples on either side, right? I think people who don't know anything about gun control laws in Russia and Brazil and Mexico, if you ask them, do they have higher murder rates than the US? People are going to correctly guess that they do, because there are a lot of other ways in which these countries differ, whether it's higher poverty rates, much more entrenched organized crime, weaker social institutions, whatever, right? Similarly, countries that have higher rates of gun ownership but lower rates of gun violence, Switzerland or Israel or whatever. You have to look, in the case of individual countries, at whether there are confounders. And you have to look just in general. I mean, there can always be statistical outliers and odd things that happen and whatever. You have to try to look in general at which countries are doing better when they're similarly situated, and what happens when laws are repealed or put in place. And you can even find, I mean, even in some of the supposed pro-gun success stories. So like Switzerland has a very high gun ownership rate.
I was going to bring up that point. Yeah.
Not as high as the US, I think.
But lower murder rates.
Very low murder rates.
Right. And compared to Germany, say, for example.
Yeah. And there are a couple of things to say about that. I mean, the reason Switzerland's gun culture is very odd because there's mandatory military service, and that's basically the reason why there's so much gun ownership, right? People have to
It's interesting.
serve in the militia, and then they keep their gun at home, and when they are too old to do it, they can buy their service weapon, and a lot of people do. But one thing to say is just, I mean, Switzerland has shockingly few murders of any sort, right? Switzerland, you can sort of guess maybe what they're doing right. I don't know, but they're doing something right such that in general, they just don't have many murders. So if the proposal is, make the US as much like Switzerland as possible in its social policies, okay, well, maybe that would be a good deal. I don't know if right-wing people really want to agree to that. But also, I mean, Switzerland does have, for instance, at least for certain kinds of guns, they have a pretty involved permit system where you have to go to the police and get a background check. And I think sometimes they can even consult a psychiatrist. They do stuff to try to keep guns away from people who might be dangerous.
Right.
There are pretty strict carry laws. Generally, people can't just carry guns around with them. So there are ways in which they do have stringent gun measures, even though for the most part, the measures are pretty loose. But it's also the case, I mean, I said that Switzerland, in general, in general, Switzerland's doing pretty good. But even within Switzerland, you do see some negative effects of firearm ownership. So in 2003, I think, they underwent an army reform, which meant that fewer people were in the militia, basically. I think people got discharged earlier and maybe there were more exemptions or something like that. I don't know the exact details, but the result of this was that fewer people were in the militia, and because gun ownership is so closely tied to that, fewer people had guns around. And sure enough, the gun suicide rate went down. Okay. And the overall suicide rate went down as well. And it seems like when you try to control for confounders, that's probably because of decreased gun availability. Right. The homicide rate is so low, I doubt there was any measure.
Because I know this is true also in places like Finland, Israel, and New Zealand, I believe, where there's this high rate of gun ownership, but less crimes. Would you say, or less murder rate in terms of guns? Would you say the same things kind of apply to those three places as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, there are places where I think you'll generally find that there are low murder rates in general.
Just in general, and you would.
And so, yeah, I mean, the suggestion is not that guns are the only factor.
Yeah, right.
The homicide rate or the suicide rate. It's just that they are a factor. And so certainly, when societies are very different in lots of other ways, they can have high gun ownership rates and still low overall levels of violence. Even though
there's much more to it than merely guns.
It might yet be that if those societies had lower gun ownership rates, they would have less gun violence. Just as Switzerland has fewer gun suicides now that they implemented this army reform.
Right. Okay, let's see here. So you just hit your camera off again. That seems to do the trick. Perfect. You're back. So yeah, just kind of want to follow up with another Sewell quote. He says virtually all empirical studies in the United States show that tightening gun control laws has not reduced crime rates in general or murder rates in particular. Is this because only people opposed to gun control do empirical studies, or is it because the facts uncovered in empirical studies make the arguments of gun control zealots untenable?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's just false.
Okay.
I mean, I talked, for instance, about the cases and in Missouri and Connecticut earlier.
Yeah, you kind of touched upon that, right?
Yeah, and again, when we try to do these cross jurisdiction analyses, we find that it seems like lots of gun measures have effects. It is also, I mean, the U.S. is kind of a difficult case and for gun laws in some ways, because we have so many different jurisdictions, right? Different state and local laws all over the place. And it's not like there's any border control between them. So, Chicago can implement harsh gun measures, but they're, an hour away from the border with Indiana or something, which has very, very loose gun laws. And so it's very easy for guns to be brought from Indiana into Chicago, right?
Right.
So there are a lot of cases where, or something similar is true with Washington, D.C. Virginia, at least, used to have very loose gun laws. So, there are a lot of cases where it's a little tricky because you have big cities that want to have strict gun laws, but they're close to states that have very loose gun laws, and guns can be moved in easily.
That's a good point.
And so if you had national level gun regulations, then things would be different, and we might see a different situation in some of those cases.
Right. So this is kind of unrelated, but what do you think of Thomas Sowell? Are you a fan of his work? Have you read any of his work?
No, I'm not much of a fan.
Not much of a fan.
Yeah, I mean, he's a smart guy,
right?
But yeah, I mean, he and I certainly have different views.
Different views. We'll leave it at that. Maybe we can have another discussion about Sowell.
Yeah.
Some other time. So question 7, Dustin. Mass shooters seem to always target gun-free zones. If these gun-free zones were equipped with guns, would this curb these mass shootings? Would we see a mitigation?
Yeah. So I think, the focus on gun-free zones is always a little odd to me because, I think that generally the reason that people don't carry guns to church or to class or to the grocery store is not that they're not allowed, right?
Yeah.
Like, I would bring all my guns with me everywhere, if only I could.
Yeah.
So, merely changing them from being gun-free zones might not have very much effect. Now, okay. Suppose we changed the carry laws, and we had some sort of cultural shift where everybody decided that they were going to carry guns with them all the time. That would have to stop some mass shootings, I guess.
Yeah,
there are cases where somebody tries to do a mass shooting and they get shot by somebody else or whatever. That would have to stop some, right? But for one thing, you have to kind of wonder about what the other psychological and social effects of that cultural shift would be, where everybody feels like they need to be armed all the time. And you also have to keep in mind that there are situations where just adding guns makes things more dangerous. So when I lived in South Bend, I lived in a pretty rough neighborhood, I guess. There was a bar like a block down the street called Frank's Place that I used to go to sometimes. They had, in the course of about 18 months, I think 10 people got shot there. And some of those, I think like one was a drug deal in the parking lot. One was a teenager who got shot by the police. But there was one incident where there was like a fight that broke out. And I guess somebody had a gun, or maybe, I don't remember the details, maybe more than one person did, but 6 people got shot. And of course that puts all the bystanders at risk. Would I have felt safer going to Frank's Place if I knew that everybody in there carried a gun with them? No, not at all. Not at all.
Right.
That would have made things way more dangerous. People would have been getting shot every day.
Every night,
Yeah, right. So, I guess it's not that there's nothing to it, but you also have to think about the other consequences of a society like that.
That's true. But yeah, just think about like Columbine, for example, how Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold went in there, and if just a teacher had a weapon instead of, I don't know how many students they killed, but you would imagine it would have been much less. But I see your point too.
It's possible though. It's always hard. At Parkland, there was this school resource officer who just didn't go in because he was scared, right?
Oh wow. Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, it's I think it was Parkland. It was at one of the multiple
Right.
shootings that happened in the past couple of years. So it's a little, I mean, everybody thinks like in this situation, yeah, I would be the badass who stops the mass shooter or whatever. And you might be, but you might not be too.
Right. Yeah. Depends. So my next question, what if there was ever a totalitarian uprising in the United States and, people were just stripped of their weapons? This would be an infringement of the Second Amendment, and kind of, it really ties into self-defense. Like most of these arguments, that's where they ultimately, end up at. So what would you say about that?
Yeah. So this is what my other paper on gun control is about.
Okay.
So this is titled, I think, Freedom, Firearms, and Civil Resistance, and it's also available. You can access online.
Oh, great. Okay.
If people want to look it up. So I think I take this argument more seriously than I think a lot of people on the left do. The standard arguments in the past have been, first of all, this is like a nutty scenario. The U.S. could never.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I run into all the time. This is ridiculous. This isn't going to happen.
And the other one is, well, look, the government has tanks and drone strikes and nuclear missiles. Like, what are you going to do with your AR-15? You can't do. I think that both of those are actually not nearly as strong as people often think. We're seeing, it looks like a phenomenon that political scientists call democratic deconsolidation in a lot of countries, where this is the flip side. People traditionally believed in something called democratic consolidation, where the thought is, when you have a liberal democracy and it's been stable for a long time, everybody gets used to the liberal democracy and you don't revert to authoritarianism anymore. You sort of become permanently stable. And it's not actually clear that this is true. I mean, we've seen, I would say, liberal democratic values lose ground in Hungary, in Brazil, in the Philippines, in the US. And so I'm not saying there will be some sort of authoritarian government in the future, but I am saying it's not so crazy that you can just laugh it off and think there's no reason to worry about it, particularly given how bad it could be, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And with regard to the sort of effectiveness worry, I mean, it's true. I don't think people with AR-15s could defeat the U.S. military in a stand-up fight.
Yeah.
But I mean, there are things you can do short of that might make a difference. I mean, you could do a lot of damage and create a lot of chaos, and that might deter a government from going authoritarian. Or you could imagine a situation. This happened in Ukraine in 2014 when there was the revolution there. There were big protests in Kiev. The military didn't want to get involved. So the protesters were fighting with basically like special riot police that were, the special security divisions. And they were shooting protesters and killing them, sniping them. And suddenly the situation changed, partly because the police began to be worried about whether there might be some sort of deal that the government cut where they would be hung out to dry, but partly because the protesters overran an armory in another city and they thought, oh no, they're going to bring the guns in and then they're going to shoot us. So as soon as that happened, the police, they cut a deal with the protesters, they all left, and the protesters took over the government. So it seems like the availability of guns in that case actually did allow them to overthrow the government, or at least made a difference. So I do think that, there is kind of a silly, I'm going to do some kind of Red Dawn, to go out into the woods and shoot down helicopters or whatever. I mean, that's not going to happen. But I mean, having a bunch of armed people on your side could make some difference, right?
For sure.
At the same time, I mean, one worry is just if we look at, the recent history of the militia movement in the US. I'm not at all convinced that the people stockpiling guns so that they can fight against tyranny or whatever are going to be against the authoritarian government, right?
That's a good point.
I don't think Oklahoma City or the Bundy Ranch or January 6th. Those don't give me a lot of hope
Right.
that these people are going to be preserving democratic values. It seems more likely that they might be a threat to them.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
Certainly. Something to take seriously.
Yeah,
it shouldn't just be brushed away.
And at the same time, there's a book by two political scientists whose names I'm going to butcher if I try to say them, because I don't know exactly what they are. So I won't try to say them. But the book is called Why Civil Resistance Works. And they show that actually, like nonviolent civil resistance, even under authoritarian regimes, tends to be more effective than violent rebellion. It tends to draw more people in. It gets people to fight against the movement less. And so it's more effective at achieving its goals, and where it's less costly because civil wars kill huge numbers of people. And where the goal is regime change, nonviolent civil resistance is more likely to lead to a democratic government after the regime change, as opposed to the new revolutionaries setting up their own authoritarian government, right? So I think you don't want to rely too heavily on this thought that, well, we'll have guns and that's the way to do it, because that might not be the way to do it. Most of the time, nonviolent civil resistance is the better way to do it. And you don't want people to resort to violence when, in fact, nonviolent resistance would have worked better in every way. Now, I do say, and this is the concession I make in the paper, I mean, the sort of paradigm successful nonviolent movement in recent American history, of course, was the civil rights movement,
right,
in the 60s. But a lot of those folks were armed. And a lot of them actually say, if we weren't armed, it couldn't have worked, because there were people who wanted to kill them, and you don't want to just go out and get killed. And so there were a lot of people who were committed to nonviolence as a political strategy, who were also willing to use violent self-defense if somebody came to their house and threw a firebomb at them or tried to lynch them or whatever.
Right.
And there were plenty of examples of successful violent self-defense. There were plenty of people who didn't get attacked, but I'm sure felt better because they had a gun. Even Martin Luther King, in the March Against Fear, which was done somewhere in the Deep South, I forget, but one of the marchers was shot by, I think, a Klansman. And afterwards, the march was escorted by armed members of a group called the Deacons for Defense of Justice, which was a sort of, community defense group. And Martin Luther King he said, look, you guys can't be part of the march because the march is nonviolent, but you can be there providing defense. And sure enough, nobody messed with them after that, right?
Okay. Right.
So it can be the case that in situations where, sort of terrorist violence carried out by police or by private citizens is being used to suppress a population, as it was during the whole Reconstruction and segregation era. It can be the case that violent self-defense can counteract that and can create space for nonviolent political action. And so as a result of that, in the paper, I do, in a very reticent and guarded way with many qualifications, I do suggest that there may be a kind of use for that kind of defensive acquisition of firearms for like indirectly political purposes. Even though, for one thing, I think anyone who does that needs to take lots of precautions and blah, blah, blah. I talk about this in the paper. And even though I don't think violent rebellion is likely to be a good tool for political change.
Right. That was a great explanation. I appreciate it. Okay, so question 9. So I read a bit of humor in college when I went to Rutgers. And what do you think of the argument from Recreational Fun? I thought that was interesting on his behalf, because again, it all really everyone they think of guns immediately, intuitively, self-defense, but you don't really think of this notion of recreational fun.
Yeah. I mean, we certainly do allow people to do some stuff that is fun, but that carries a risk, right? Sometimes even a risk to other people, I guess. If you like flying your private plane around or something, you could crash into somebody's house. Yeah, so I mean, it's not like it's just goofy in principle. I guess I would say one thing is lots of gun control measures don't really infringe on that. Waiting periods. I mean, maybe you have to wait a little bit and you won't be able to have fun with your gun during that period or something. But another thing to say is, I mean, I don't really believe that countries with stricter gun control measures, people just have less fun in their lives. Because you have to think not only about the recreational value of guns, but also about what that could be substituted with if you didn't have guns and you didn't have a gun culture and stuff. And not only are there lots of totally different things you could do, but I mean, even in a society, I mean, imagine all civilian firearm ownership is illegal, which, I mean, there's no chance of that happening in the US. And I don't think it would be a good idea to push for that. But supposing it was, I mean, right. You could still have gun ranges where you can go and shoot guns. You can still have bow hunting. You can still have paintball, airsoft gun. I mean, there still are a lot of gun-like things you can do that are like pretty fun. And so, I mean, it is true there are people who just like collecting guns, and they some of them honestly probably like the thought that this is like a lethal weapon. That,
right. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, at some point, okay, maybe they'll suffer a little bit, and you have to kind of consider, okay, how many deaths are we willing to accept to like let people just have something that they think is cool because it can kill people.
Right.
And I guess I think the answer is not too many.
I think I would agree. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's something to the argument, but I think a lot of the recreational value of guns can be preserved even with sensible gun control measures. And there are lots of other things people can do that are fun too. And so on balance, I doubt that this really defeats the case for gun control.
Right. I don't think it's a severe deprivation.
Yeah. And I mean, even humor, even humor says this isn't his main argument. This.
Yeah. Right.
The really important one for him is the self-defense argument.
That prima facie.
Yeah.
Self-defense. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's it, man. I really appreciate you being here. It was a great discussion.
Yeah. Thanks.
So yeah, absolutely. Hopefully have you back on soon. We can talk about more fun stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Take care, Dustin.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.